Greetings. This lecture is group decision making. Specifically, what are the different ways that groups make decisions? And some of them are more autonomous and consensus building than other forms. But when we have groups, and as most of our working conditions are working in a group context these days, we want to explore the range of ways that groups can make decisions and under what conditions those work best. Before we get into discussing the different methods by which groups can make decisions, it's important that we look at the group process in and of itself, because this helps to inform some of the issues that we may have around making group decisions. So, the group process basically proceeds like this, as a rule. I mean, obviously there are exceptions to the rule. Some of these stages are not always uniform in length. Some of them are shorter, some of them are longer. It really depends on how well the group knows each other and their willingness to work to become a good performing unit. So it starts with the forming. We have to decide, who is going to be in the team, what's the team's purpose, and identify the individuals who are going to be a part of that. So that forming process is where the team has to come together, understand its general mission, and get to know each other as individuals. In the next step of the process, the storming stage, needless to say, once you put diverse people on a team together, there are some tensions and some issues that are going to inhibit them from becoming a smooth running machine right away. There may be pulls and pushes for power, there may be disagreements on process and how the team needs to function. They may have different interpretations of what the overall mission and vision is for the company and for their team, but the bottom line is the storming phase is where they are trying to work out the kinks and work out the conflicts and work out the differences of opinion so that they can move forward to get the project actually done. The next phase after that is norming. And again, once we've had that little storm, and it may be very brief or it may be very long-standing, depending on the tensions that exist in the team, the bottom line is the next step is the norming phase, where the team starts to agree to what the agreed upon process will be, what the agreed upon expectations will be. They start to get into a rhythm or design the rhythm by which they will be doing their work and the standards by which they're going to hold themselves. The performing stage is where they actually are getting to the work and they're doing it in a smooth, well-functioning way, and they're moving through that whole process. The last phase is the adjourning, and not every team adjourns. Sometimes a team adjourns when an individual leaves the team because that team now changes. Once you move and change the membership of the team, you're closing the door on the old way of doing things and opening the door on a new way of doing things. So the adjourning phase could be a formal process where if the team was a temporary team, we close down the mission, the vision, we say goodbye to each other and we move on to another project. We could also have a sort of a minor adjournment, if you will, when an individual may leave the team or a new individual may join the team, in which case then to a greater or lesser extent, there's going to be new storming and norming, perhaps, because we have to get that person who's new to the team up to speed and getting them to a place where they're much more comfortable. So adjourning is not always this final goodbye and this grand goodbye. It can be how we change the team based on membership changing at the edges. And as every new person enters or exits the team, or the group, it changes, quite readily. So the first sort of group decision process is actually an autocratic decision process. And with an autocratic leader or an autocratic group decision style, there's a very clear leader who makes the decision all on their own, and then the individuals on the team basically are forced to do what that team leader says. There's not a lot of feedback, there's not a lot of communication, there's not a lot of rationale necessarily. It should be, but not necessarily. An autocratic leader comes in and says, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, get it done, here's the deadline, and people will work together as a team to get it done, but The team members don't really have a say in things. They're simply been forced to work on the project, however the leader defines it. This is really good when it's a minor trivial issue or if there's a crisis. These kind of structures work really well. Just as we talked about that the kind of leadership style, the directive style, works best when you're in a crisis or when time is of the essence. You don't have time for debate. You don't have time for negotiating things. And when it's trivial, who cares, right? It's not a big deal, so we don't need to have buy-in. We just are going to get the work done. But, when there's a larger, more drawn-out project, when time isn't of the essence, this becomes a big problem for team members because they don't feel like they have a voice in that process. They don't feel like they have buy-in. They feel frustration, and maybe even boredom with doing the work or feeling sort of psychologically or physically disconnected from the whole process, because if they don't have a say in it, they don't have any buy-in and they're not necessarily going to care about doing it in the highest quality way possible. So what's really important in an autocratic style, if you're going to do it, is make sure you do it when it's appropriate, when it's a minor or trivial issue or if it's a crisis. And it's also important very quickly to communicate your rationale to people, because if you're going to be autocratic in your style, at a minimum, people need to understand why you've done it that way. And they may not question it, certainly depending on the crisis or the context of what's going on. That autocratic style may be the appropriate approach, but it's very important, again, to let people know this is why we're doing this. Move on. Here's the reason why. I'll talk about it and debrief it later, but this is what I need to have done in this moment with these parameters, period. With expert member soliciting, what we're doing is, as a team, recognizing that our expertise may be very limited in a particular area. And so the team makes the decision to go to an outside subject matter expert, whoever that might be, whether it's your boss or another colleague or somebody outside of the company, getting that information, bringing it in, and allowing that person to inform the team about some facts and about what's going on. And this way the team has to decide what's relevant, what's not, what's going to work. For that expert member to come in and to lead that team, it's really important that they understand the organization itself, because they're trying to provide information to the organization, and if they don't get the dynamics, they don't get how that basically works, it's going to be a problem. So the team has to be able to sort through the data and recognize what's relevant and what's not. The expert member and the subject matter expert who's giving the advice also needs to recognize where are there similarities, where it makes sense for that information to be used there, and where are there dissimilarities where the information that they're sharing may not necessarily be relevant. So this is both parties need to recognize what might work and what might not work. In a consultative decision-making style, though the leader or the de facto leader of the group may get input from all the members of the team. This is very different from the autocratic style where they're not getting feedback. The consultative individual is getting the feedback, they're taking all sorts of ideas into consideration, and then ultimately making the decision on their own. They're consulting with people who may be experts, they're consulting with people who know their job really well, but sometimes the leader has to make that key decision. There are times, though, when using that consultative decision-making process, the leader may look indecisive, or the leader may look like they're not willing or able to make the decision, or it may look like they don't care what the team members are saying about it. The bottom line is, if you're going to use a consultative approach, it has to be legit. You have to be able to acknowledge that you're taking people's ideas, that you like the ideas that they offer to you, and that you're integrating it at some level. You definitely don't want to tip your hat and let people know, tip your hand rather, and let people know in advance what your ideas are, because you're going to get that anchoring bias, right? You're going to get the person who says to you, oh, well, this is what you wanted, so we're just building on that idea. What you want in a consultative style is to not tip your hand, to not let people know what your ideas are, because this way you get fresh ideas that may come in that you didn't think of. I mean, and that's your goal, right? If you are going to be reaching out to a group and saying, I want your feedback, the last thing you want is just to feed them your ideas, because you're not taking advantage of the variety of ideas and expertise that your group members have. You're simply pushing them to give you the answer you want, which is more of a form of a confirmation bias, if you will. So the consultative style is really good at empowering people, but it can be very time consuming. It's going to take a while for people to think, to brainstorm, and to get those ideas back to you. Let them know that you have an opinion about what you would like to do, but it's definitely imperative that you don't let them know what your idea is, because then they'll just give you that idea back. Lastly, you always want to incorporate their suggestions to the extent that you can, or at a minimum, give the rationale why it was not used. In this circumstance, if people feel like their voice is being heard, they're more likely to buy into it. Even if their idea is not being used, if they understand the rationale for why things are being done that way, they learn more about the situation, the context, the concern. They also recognize, that you heard them, but they can also get why maybe that idea didn't work and would not work necessarily. In a minority control situation, we will set it up so that there is a small group. And you can liken this to having the board of directors and then giving you a proxy to the board of directors of all the shareholders, right? The idea is that we are entrusting a minority group to make decisions for the rest of us. And if we give them our proxy, then they're making a decision on our behalf. If we don't give the proxy, then obviously we have voice in the process. So the goal here is a small proportion, a small subset of your larger group is making the decision for the group. Sometimes this makes sense when there's time constraints and we don't have a lot of time to make a decision, or there may be logistical constraints. And think about it this way: not every shareholder in the world can come to the Apple shareholder meeting when it's held on that particular day. Just as a humorous aside, I own stock in the Green Bay Packers. I know, right? I'm a total cheesehead. But I don't ever go to meetings. Even though technically I'm a shareholder, I don't go to meetings because it's inconvenient. It's not at a time that works for me. So I don't get to go to the meeting. But, when the team wants to make their own decisions, I send my proxy in and they make the decisions all on their own. I don't question or feel like I have any expertise in what it takes to run a football team. So it's also really good to use this style if you know that you've got a core group of people at the top who have an expertise that the rest of the team doesn't have. And again, this can be a challenge. There can be risks, because if the team is not comfortable with that small minority, and that small minority might actually try to control the team and not really represent everybody's interests. And, we've heard stories of that, with Wall Street and boards of directors, where the board of directors is not really representing what the rest of the shareholders want. They're just doing what they want to do. So that could be a concern. Our goal here, of course, is if you're in minority control, if you're one of those minority control leaders, you want to hear a voice from everybody. You want to make sure that you're clearly representing what the group wants. And however you define what the group wants, or whatever process you use to define what the group wants, is up to the team. The team has to be in agreement, obviously, on how that's going to work. But when you have a minority control, not everybody gets the same voice. So the best approach here is, if you have a minority control, make sure that the group is clear what the decision process will be, that there's a mechanism for their voice to be heard by that leadership, and then allowing them to turn around and make sure that work gets done. In a majority rule or majority control situation, this is democracy at its best, right? We always do things with a simple majority or a 2/3 majority, to make sure that truly the majority really represents most people. When you think about utilitarian analysis or utility analysis, it's always greatest good for the greatest amount of people. And the goal here with majority control is that it is a democratic process, and the winner's choice wins. So you have to vote on it. This way you get feedback from everybody. Everybody's voice is heard one way or the other. The challenge, of course, is you may have a hard time getting majority rule. The other challenge you may have is that if it's just a simple majority, there are a lot of people that may have different ideas and feel like their voice isn't being heard. So if you really want to approach consensus as best as you can using a majority control approach, then using the 2/3 majority helps. It's not just a simple majority. It's most of the people. It's 66 or 67% of them, or more, depending on how it works. You have to meet that threshold. And that makes everybody feel like, yes, even though a number of people may have a disagreement, if the majority feels this is right, you sort of go along with the majority. It can be a time-consuming process. You can also have a situation where you have those dominant leaders who are really quieting the minority groups and minority opinions, or the challenge is if you're in that minority opinion, you might feel like your voice is never heard, or your voice and your ideas are not being considered, because it wouldn't necessarily be considered in a majority control situation as it would, say, in a consultative situation. So again, same sort of thing as you would with minority control. Majority control, make sure we've got mechanisms so that everybody's voice is heard and that it's done fairly, and that helps minimize some of the anxieties and challenges we have with that. The majority control situation is that it's a win-lose. It's a zero sum. It's either the majority wins, or and the minority loses, and that becomes a problem for so many people. And of course, it's sort of a paradigm, or whatever. It's just sort of, it mocks what's going on in our own political process. When it's majority rules, it's a win-lose. We don't really think about compromise or collaboration in order to get things done. So we're just a nice little microcosm of what's sort of going on in the larger political arena, if you will. And it's great examples of political control and group decision making. We're trying to make decisions for the whole United States, and when some groups, and both groups, right, stand their ground based on ideological reasoning, nothing gets done. Whether you're Democrats standing firm on certain issues or Republicans doing the exact same thing, there's no room for compromise in that context. That's why it becomes win-lose. It's a natural outcropping, a natural output from a majority control process. The last group decision-making process is consensus. In essence, this is the holy grail, right? If we can do a win-win agreement, if we can get consensus from everybody, the goal is that's what we want to approach. But that's not always the best approach. It certainly it depends on the context, right? Certainly, if time is of the essence, the last thing we want to be doing is working on a consensus, because that's going to drive everybody nuts. Because you can't get consensus in a very short period of time. It's very difficult, unless the project is really simple. When you have a simple project, you can get consensus and you can move forward. But then again, if you have a simple project, consensus approach is not always going to be on the forefront of people's minds. If it's a simple project, maybe the autocratic approach is the way to go, or, to just get it done and move on. When we're talking about consensus, we're not always talking about 100% agreement, because again, remember, most people satisfice. So if we're talking about a consensus approach, we're talking about satisficing. We have to be minimally satisfied with the results and with what the outcomes are going to be. So as long as people have voice, as long as the people have input, if their outcome is minimally satisfying and they can let go of some issues that are at the periphery of what their needs and wants are, and make sure their core issues are being addressed, then that's maybe the way it's going to work. All groups, though, have to have their voice in the process, but along with that, it becomes a very time-consuming, interpersonally demanding process. It takes a long time to get things done. And if you're truly using consensus, the leader, the manager can't say, well, this is how it is, because then it's not consensus. Then it becomes autocratic, right? So the goal here is, as a manager, if you want your teams to do a consensus work, they need to make sure they've got the resources to be able to do the job, all the information needed, and all the time available to them to be able to do that. Because the goal is, when you allow the groups that time and that flexibility, while it may take a while, you're going to get better and more creative decisions done, because everybody has a voice in that process. So what are some of the advantages of the group decision-making process? Well, ideally, there's more alternatives, right? When you have more people, more voices, more ideas, more perspectives, more lenses that are you looking at the scenario, you get more alternatives. You also get more buy-in, because if my voice is heard and if I feel like my idea is being considered, if I'm involved in the process, I will be more likely to buy into the outcome. Group process also enables people to cross-pollinate, to share information, to learn new skills. So when you're working in a group and we're making decisions as a group, I can learn something new or develop a new skill by working with people that I may never have experience working with before, diverse others. It also enhances the empowerment aspect. When your company is really good at empowering the workers to make good decisions, this enhances your empowerment, and in the end, your workers are going to feel much better about their work output, and get into those ideas of autonomy, mastery, and purpose, because I feel like I'm doing something that's meaningful and I feel empowered to be able to make those decisions. And so the more power and empowerment we can give to groups, the better that is going to play off on the advantages of teams and play into the intrinsic motivators. Needless to say, however, there are always problems associated with diverse groups. I think this is all stuff we're very familiar with. There's a concept out there called groupthink, and it's debated whether or not it exists in reality, but the challenges, the symptoms of what one would define as groupthink are all issues that need to be managed. The idea of dominant leaders and self-censorship and mind guards that are quieting people and saying you can't talk, you can't do this. When we have decision failures, a lot of times it's because of the challenges of people not talking to each other and people not allowing dissenting opinions to bubble up. Now, not every time that happens doesn't mean we have a bad decision, but typically when there are bad decisions, those kinds of behaviors will contribute to that poor decision. So, groupthink is an issue, and we'll get into the symptoms of groupthink in a moment. Dominant members, big, loud, obnoxious people who are dominating the group, who don't allow others to speak, who feel like their ideas are the only ideas that matter. This becomes a problem. It quiets introverts. They don't want to talk. It quiets dissent. When someone is a big bully in the middle of the team and saying, this is how it's got to be, this is what we're going to do. So, we should tread lightly in sort of figuring out what the dynamics of the team are going to be like, and not go in like a bull in the china shop feeling like you've got to fight for your voice. We should make sure we create a group process that allows all voices to be heard. Just as we might have dominant members or a fight for power, we also have social loafing, and people who really don't want to put their efforts into the group process. They want to just free ride or social loaf on what the team process is going to be. So I hang on, I let the team do its own thing, and then I basically don't worry so much about, what my role is going to be, because the team will cover for me, right? There's strength in numbers, there's enough people, I can kind of hide in the group, I can, not do my share, and, the process moves forward. We see this a lot obviously in student projects. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in the workplace as well. But of course, there are better mechanisms, I think, than in the workplace to address these issues, as opposed to maybe in academia. Everybody's, there are concerns about how to handle social loafing, and every teacher approaches it very differently. In terms of risky behavior and risky shift, we've already talked about this, that when we're working in groups, the groups tend to behave more risky, and so that increases the likelihood we're going to have some challenges. And then lastly, this idea of self-censorship. People will, not speak their mind because they either feel bullied by the dominant leaders, or they feel challenged and therefore they don't feel like their opinion matters, or that they don't want to take a risk of opening up their mouth and saying something because they feel like there may be a backlash against them for opening up their mouth, and whether it's whistleblowing or anything along that line. So self-censorship becomes a problem as well. So what are the examples and symptoms of groupthink? Well, number one, again, as you can see, a lot of these parallel a lot of the decision-making biases from the previous lecture. This idea of I'm invulnerable, or at least there's an illusion that I'm invulnerable. Nobody can touch me, sort of that, can't touch this kind of thing. The goal here, the situation here is that the leader feels so strong and so powerful that they don't believe anybody can have an impact on them and change their mind, so no one can touch me, They rationalize or discount warnings, and so as they get disconfirming evidence in, as they start seeing things that may be outside of their expectations, they discount it, or they say, no, that's not relevant, it's not important. And so that they start to rationalize people who are saying, hey, we've got to be careful, we should look out for this, and they rationalize those warnings away. Morality and ethics starts to decline, where people will start to do things that are considered unethical. Well, no one's looking, so I can do it. And again, we have to be mindful of enhancing and ensuring that moral decisions are being made. And so as we start to see the ethical decline of those decisions, we know that we're getting into a point where there's this mentality that, no one's going to question me, and we're just going to do what we're going to do. Stereotyping the enemies or naysayers. You're either with me or you're against me. And we saw that in that video clip by Jonathan Haidt. The bottom line is, groupthink starts to happen when we tell the people who are playing devil's advocate, who are showing us that there may be issues and concerns and warnings out there, that we make them the enemy. Then the group and mob mentality kicks in, and you're not with us, you're not a member of the team, you don't really care, you're not a true American, you're not a true, whatever, and that puts pressure on the person. And as we'll talk about this issue of self-censorship in a second, that's where those sorts of situations where you become the enemy and the naysayer, that's one of those factors that contributes to self-censorship. People don't want to open up their mouth if they're going to be told that they are the enemy. So because of that stereotyping and because of these rationalizations and this sort of slide into unethical decisions and this invulnerability, there becomes this pressure to conform. So people put pressure on those who are the naysayers, who are the outsiders, to conform, to agree, to do what we say, because if you don't, there's going to be consequences. That results in the self-censorship. So it gives this illusion that there's unanimity, that everybody agrees. But instead, what you're seeing is people are afraid to open up their mouth. And it's not that they're unanimous, it's just that they're not opening up their mouth. But the problem is, if you don't open up your mouth, it looks like it's unanimous because no one's challenging it. One of the ways these things happen, and one of the ways that the pressure gets put on those to conform, is through mind guards. People who will come in and the leader won't do this, but they have their henchmen, if you will, who will do this, who will come in and say, well, you really need to do this or there's going to be trouble. And sort of a humorous aside, my ex-husband used to work for the city of New York under the Rudy Giuliani administration around the time of 9/11, and he would always come home laughing and joking, and he'd say, yep, the henchman came in today from Giuliani's office. They wanted to make sure I was doing what he wanted, as opposed to what I thought would be the right or legal approach to doing something. So, these henchmen are not formal henchmen. They're just the people that the leader tasks with going in and doing the dirty work, so that they can keep their hands clean and they can look like they are, a good leader, or they look that they're, they are, benevolent, et cetera, et cetera. So as much as you can say a lot of, decent things about Rudy Giuliani for a lot of different reasons, I still laugh when I see, him being touted as, a great leader, because, I know some of these behind the scenes things, and it's a little frustrating for me to see that, he's engaged in using many of these kind of tactics as an autocratic leader. That creates this tension and a propensity for groupthink, unfortunately. So remedies for groupthink are pretty broad, and a lot of them make perfect sense, right? We want to have someone who's a devil's advocate or a critical evaluator, and you can see that, they're not quite the same thing, but they all get at the same context. It's someone who just is out there, who's capable of looking at things critically and saying this is going to work and this is not going to work. You want to make sure as you're assigning the project, like we talked about with the consultative leadership style, is be impartial. Tell them what you want them to do. Tell them how you want, you don't want to tell them how to do it, but you want to tell them this is what the parameters are, this is what we're working within, give me some solutions. This way you avoid creating the context for groupthink, because even if you don't want that, sometimes your subordinates will engage in those kind of behaviors, and perhaps think about how that might differ based on national culture. Certain national cultures have such deference to authority, they'll never question you, and that is ripe for groupthink issues. So, when you give out your directions, make sure it's impartial, that you don't tip your hand and let them know what it is that you would like to see as a solution. Divide the project into multiple groups and multiple diverse groups, so that you don't have one in-group or minority control group who's controlling the agenda and the ideas. So multiple ideas allows for multiple things to bounce off. Make sure the group members, once the preliminary ideas are gathered, they go back to other divisions, other departments, get some feedback, let those ideas be critically analyzed by their subordinates and other peers, and then bring those questions and concerns back to the team again. Make sure outside experts have an eyeball on the process, because a lot of times outside experts see things that insiders don't see. The devil's advocate, as I said, the critical evaluator. Force yourself to consider alternative scenarios, that it's not enough to just say, well, A and B, it works. Just as we talked about the decision-making bias that, get anchored into a particular idea, force yourself to really think about different scenarios. If you don't give someone, an idea about what you want, you're not going to have the anchor problem and the anchoring bias problem. You're going to create the opportunity for them to think about these different ideas and these different scenarios in their own ways and in their own manners. Just as like we would want multiple groups, sometimes we want different subgroups, again, to break up your coalitions. We want to make sure that the coalitions are not all in one spot, that they're divided out, so we avoid some of those problems. And then allowing ourselves to have what we call a second chance meeting. The second chance meeting says, okay, we've got an idea, let's go home, 24 hours, come back, and let's see if this idea still makes sense. And be willing to critically look at it and allow, if you think about those 3 C's for decision making, right? To allow for the critique of it without it being personal is really imperative. Everybody I know, certainly once they've gotten into more advanced ages, have engaged in some sort of brainstorming. And when I mean advanced ages, I mean like teenager and older in the workplace, that kind of thing, not, people who are older, 60s, etc. So as anybody starts working, with groups, it's natural to brainstorm about solutions to things. And that's a great idea, right? Because brainstorming generates ideas, you take advantage of the multiple perspectives of people, and then you can filter those ideas into something fun. But again, we know that diverse groups have all sorts of challenges with more conflict and judgment of ideas, dominant leaders that take over, and those sorts of things. So there should be some clear rules for how to brainstorm. And not every decision-making process is a structured process. And we'll talk about some structured ways to manage, brainstorming in a more structured way, but sometimes it's just a free-rein brainstorming, and it's a great idea. The rules for this are, number 1, defer judgment. Don't judge an idea as it gets thrown out. Add it to a list. Just put it down in what we call the parking lot. Write it down. Don't judge it. Just keep going. As these ideas start to build on your list, you can then combine ideas and build on ideas that others had and say, well, that's kind of a cool idea, but how about if we add this in there, and would that make the solution better? Sometimes it does, sometimes it's ridiculous. But the whole idea is that we don't want to judge those ideas while the creative process is being worked on, because blocking someone's creativity is going to shut them up. They're going to be more likely to just close their mouth and walk away. They won't engage in the process anymore, and we want to hear from everybody. Encourage crazy ideas. Encourage the let's dance on the moon idea. It may not be feasible, but it doesn't mean that dancing on the moon might not trigger another idea that might be more realistic. So let's not judge it, just put it up there, let it go, let it have some fun, allow for the levity and the creativity of it to hopefully inspire other ideas that might work more readily. But let those wild ideas go out there and don't judge them in advance. Go for quantity, not quality. I mean, we spend so much time going, oh, that's a really good idea, oh, that's a really good idea, and only focusing on a narrow group because we feel like they're high quality decisions. Brainstorming is about quantity. Brainstorming is about getting all crazy ideas, exhausting your brain and coming up with all sorts of crazy ideas and putting it out there. As you're brainstorming, make it visual. Use those, use notepads, use chalkboards, use, those giant, easels and sticky notes and put them everywhere. Let the visual ideas help percolate creativity as well. The more visual we are, the more that may trigger stuff. I mean, sometimes you have to look at something for a while before it triggers, an interesting solution. We also want to be careful as we're brainstorming to encourage the wild ideas, but make sure we don't go off topic. It's easy for people to go off on a tangent, and we have to be really good about saying, that's really cool. How is it relevant to what we're talking about? And it's not a judgment, it's a question. Right? So you don't want to judge as you're trying to keep the person on topic. You want to ask them important questions. Let them show you how it might be related to the topic. If it's not, they'll see that right away, and then they can walk away from it and say, yeah, you're right, we're a little off topic. So, all right, let's go back to what we were doing here and figure out what are some more good ideas based on the topic that we're addressing. You can't have multiple conversations, one conversation at a time. So when there's a lot of sub-conversations going on, that's when you have your subgroups and your coalitions working. The goal is it's one conversation, and what everybody says should be heard by everybody. And that's the way we would want to approach this. There are structured ways that groups or teams can brainstorm. And one structured brainstorming method is called the nominal group technique. And the idea here is this technique minimizes all of those process losses that one would expect to see with group decision making. For example, we're more likely to not have a dominant leader. We're more likely to get ideas from everybody, that people don't get to just be silent. They can write their ideas down. Even if they don't open up their mouth to talk, their ideas out there in writing. So with the nominal group technique, it's a very clear, structured process. First of all, everybody has to ensure that they agree on what the problem is and that it's understood by everybody. So then you take some time, whatever it is, for everybody to generate some ideas on their own. And then what happens is the ideas, we go around the room in a round-robin fashion, and we just put ideas either on a blackboard or a flip chart or what have you, with no judgment, no questions. We simply write the ideas down. After the ideas are recorded, we allow for some discussion where, we might ask some clarifying questions about what is this idea, what does this mean, and we allow ourselves to sort of get clarity on each of the items. Then each individual gets a second to look at an idea that they like, or maybe an idea that they generated that they like the most, and do a 30-second soapbox where they argue for an idea and say this is why this idea works, or they might argue against an idea and say this idea is not going to work for these reasons and here's the critical reasons why. While in principle it makes sense, this is not going to work because we don't have these resources. And that's a reasonable way to go about managing that. The goal here is with these 30-second soapboxes is each person is allowed to sort of share why they like or don't like an idea. And then it gives an opportunity for any more clarity that people want to ask regarding the idea. But the soapbox really tries to expand people's understanding of what each of those items are and gets a sense of where what people like or don't like. Then ultimately you vote anonymously. And again, the nice thing is that anonymously it gets rid of your dominant leader and those mind guards and the pressure to vote in a certain way. You can do it anonymously. Nobody knows. And so you do your top choices. Your top choice gets 3 points, your second choice gets 2 points, your third choice gets 1 point, and you only do your top 3, and you start to see where the numbers play out. And the thing with the most numbers kind of wins. And it combines that majority rule sort of process, but again, you can make a decision about, does it have to be a supermajority? And if we only take then, everybody has their top 3 choices and they're sort of disparate, do we want to narrow in then on the top 3 choices and say, that people voted on and say, okay, well, let's get rid of these other ideas and let's talk again about, how these different choices might be good and why did we like this one over that one and why did someone feel like this is a good choice, and you can start to narrow your process down a little bit more. If you keep the anonymity, if you keep the silent generation of ideas and the lack of judgment as people are sharing ideas, you're going to end up in a really good place, I think, personally, getting past some of the challenges of working in diverse groups. As close as you can, try to follow that nominal group technique and really do allow for different ideas to generate and be out there, without judgment. And, eventually you'll come to a good decision. A friend of mine's done some research in this area, and we found that the most creative process came from structured brainstorming. That structured brainstorming really did a much better job of helping teams to be more creative than if they simply just did, a brainstorming session without any clear rules or parameters. Another way that we can do structured brainstorming is through a thing called the Delphi technique, and this is not as popular anymore because we have more computer-based programs that enables us to make threaded discussions and anonymous feedback. But it was designed, again, when you have people who are geographically dispersed, to allow them to have anonymous input into an idea. An idea may be sent around via email or snail mail, whatever that is, but the idea is, here's our problem, let's throw in ideas. And so because the ideas are tossed in anonymously, we get rid of that dominant leader approach. You may still have problems with anchoring biases and things like that, but the whole idea is people are adding their ideas to the process. So everybody has to review the problem, they put in their ideas, they review feedback on the ideas, they have to set priorities on what they should do, and ultimately it goes back to the group, and it's this sort of round-robin process of being involved. This is time-consuming, though. It's better if we can do it in an online environment through what we call a group decision process or a threaded discussion that makes it easier for everybody to access the information, even in an anonymous way. Gets it all taken care of in one spot, as opposed to having to go through the process of reviewing and emailing and resending things out. The last thing, as I already referred to in the previous slide, is this idea of using group decision-making software, GDSS, group decision systems. The idea is that we want to use the technology to help us to make better decisions and to sort of manage some of those challenges that come along with groups. We want to get the best of the groups without all of the dominant leader and conflict issues that come into play. So you could do what we call a chauffeur-driven system, where there's a bunch of questions and people answer it, and then it gets all collated and submitted to the decision maker. You could do what we call group drive meetings, where there is a threaded discussion, where people can put input on ideas and build on ideas, and sort of they can do this without being face-to-face. And so it enables you to minimize some of those process losses of the emotionality and the dopamine rush of everybody going, oh, great idea, and then moving off in a head direction. The goal is, let's have it anonymous. Everybody gets to put their input on a screen or in a website for everybody to see. It can be simultaneous. It can be live, so we can see the changes as they come in. And that enables people in diverse locations to make decisions. But even if they're not in diverse locations, it tries to minimize some of those process losses of being a diverse team. Then what you do also lose, which can be a detriment, is you do lose a lot of nonverbals, which can help in the decision-making process. Sometimes there's a lot being said in nonverbals that gets lost when we're online. And so it's a trade-off. If people are pretty comfortable, in that sort of anonymous, computerized module, and they're not worried about the nonverbals, it's not as important, then, that can work really well for you. But if the nonverbals and the way that nonverbals work within teams is important to the process, then you might want to go with maybe the nominal group technique approach. So the goal of this lecture was to really go through the different kinds of ways that groups make decisions, see how they're in parallel to some of the challenges of decision-making biases, and then come up with some reasonable solutions for how we can avoid those problems. And so these different methods for brainstorming and avoiding groupthink are really essential for how we will function most of the time in the workplace, because most of our work is done in groups.